Hello there, my favorite randos on the internet. Thank you for joining me on a live episode of Let's Disagree, a very special episode, a follow up to our Pious fraud panel from a few weeks ago. And with that, we're going to jump right into it. And I'm going to introduce my two very special guests for tonight. Returning back from our first Pious Frauds panel is Sloan Smart. Sloan, how you doing tonight?
I'm well. Great Vogel. He's a titan amongst us mere mortals, and I'm just here to help the conversation move along.
Cool. I think you cut out a little bit, but I heard you on the back end. You're doing good. We're here to talk about Pious Fraud Part 2.
And we're more.
He sounds like Stephen Hawking's to me.
Yeah, he is roboting out a little bit. And our other guest, really our expert for today's panel, is Dan Vogel. Dan, it is such a pleasure to have you on Let's Disagree. I've been a huge fan of your work really since the middle of my faith crisis. And just really appreciate you taking the opportunity to respond to some questions. Anything you want to say to kind of introduce yourself or frame today's episode?
Well, I'm Dan Vogel, and I've been publishing in Mormon history for over 35 years. And I'm glad to be here on Let's Disagree. I like this show. I watch it all the time.
Oh, Dan, that is so kind. When I saw your favorable comments on the first panel, it truly made my day because, I don't know, I'm an attorney and I don't get very many positive influences in my day. Anyways, well, I'm going to start by kind of framing this by talking about, why we did this first panel, get Dan's thoughts on this first panel. One of the things I want to do, because Let's Disagree is all about modeling respectful disagreement, is also try and steelman Sloan's position from the first panel. And then we're going to kind of get into the substance, ask Dan some questions. Folks in the live chat, if you have questions for Dan, he's more than willing to sit through and entertain those. This panel first started, the panel from a couple of weeks ago started because I had used the term pious fraud in reference to Joseph Smith in a different episode. I often talk about how that's kind of my view of Joseph Smith. My understanding of the theory really came from reading Dan's first book, Joseph Smith, Making of a Prophet. Remind me, Dan, when did you publish that? 2005? Is that right?
4, I believe.
2004.
I think it was 2004, just before the 200-year anniversary of Joseph Smith's birth.
That's right.
So, and the Pious Fraud, it was called the Prophet Puzzle Revisited article that's where I laid out the theory, was in 1998. So a little while ago. It was republished a few times in other sources. And I'm glad to be here to talk about it.
Yeah, me too.
I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it really entails.
Yeah, I think there is too. One of the things I thought was interesting about the first panel is not that I want to get into necessarily like a semantical discussion or debate, but the way I look at pious fraud is it's a term of art. And so the way that I don't really think that we can answer the question by looking at like strict definitions of pious or even fraud is because it is a term of art that I think you recognize, and I shared in the first panel, is kind of an oxymoron. It's kind of a contradiction. It's kind of a paradox. It's not necessarily a perfect term, but I kind of look at it like any other term of art, which I'm very used to dealing with in my day job as a lawyer. It would be akin to if someone wants to argue that pious fraud isn't necessarily the best way to describe Joseph Smith. To me, it feels a little bit like arguing that reasonable suspicion, a legal term of art that we use all the time, isn't all that reasonable. It's kind of like because those terms have become a term of art, they kind of have their own meaning that we have to kind of understand. That's one of the areas where I feel like the first panel maybe kind of didn't understand that piece. And that's probably on me as the moderator for not framing it as well as I probably could have. But I wanted to give you a chance, Dan, to just kind of explain, where did pious fraud come from? Where historically was it used? Are you the one who coined the term? Like, what really is the theory behind pious fraud?
All right, it's not an easy term to understand or a concept to grasp. Holding this dichotomous, what are you doing? Lying for the Lord? How you're, we Mormons have come to know that term "lying for the Lord" really well lately.
Right.
Not always, not all the way through its history, but lately it's been brought up by, the critics. So we're partway there with lying for the Lord. But I didn't coin it. I didn't make it up. I actually drew it out of Joseph Smith's environment. And it's a term used by scholars for religious fakery. There's all that pious fraud has a long history. And it goes back to the Old Testament times when the book of Deuteronomy was pretended to be found in the ruins of the temple when the Israelites returned, or the Jews returned to Jerusalem after their Babylonian captivity. It was a way of introducing Deuteronomy, a repetition of the law that included a lot of things that the other 4 books of Moses didn't include. And so the purpose of doing that kind of fraud is to garner authority or to smuggle in some kind of doctrine that's not clearly expressed in the previous scriptures. And
so in that sense, is it very connected to pseudepigrapha then?
Yes. Pseudepigrapha has a long history too, in both the Old Testament, Intertestament times, and during the New Testament. It actually contains books that scholars don't believe, let's say, that Paul wrote, like Timothy,
or Hebrews,
Titus,
maybe, right?
Things like that. So it doesn't matter where they came from. We don't know who wrote these. So a lot of them are anonymous. But even if we did, it wouldn't matter. And no one really cares about whether the person that did it was actually pious. That's not the issue. The issue is, what was the purpose of the fraud? The purpose was pious, meaning to promote the faith, to improve the faith in some way that they believed it needed improvement, or to garner authority. I mean, it's not only writings like pseudepigrapha, it's also relics, like the bones of the saints. Different parishes or churches would claim that they had the bones of whatever saint entombed in their church, and that would give them prestige, and people would flock there and want to go there, and they would pay money to see them and things like that. So there's relics, and that's, to me, aligns with Joseph Smith creating the plates, and having a seer stone, and pretending like he had the breastplate or sword of Laban. And so these were relics. They felled them through the cloth. That was a form of creating a pious fraud. So the fraud's pious.
Yeah. So if I understand you correctly, and I think I do, it's acknowledging that we know Joseph Smith knows, or we believe that Joseph Smith knows he was deceiving people, but he ultimately believes that deception is legitimately justified by his sincere religious beliefs, if I'm understanding the theory correctly. Right.
And I would go one step further, which is, I believe he believed he got a commandment to do that he worked it out in his mind, a scheme by which he can convert primarily his family, but friends, other people that would normally not be converted, because the Bible was under attack in the 19th century by the deists.
Right.
And he was going to fix all of that. He was going to put down sectarian strife because they were arguing with each other over the mode of baptism, the name of the church, whether infants should be baptized, all sorts of things, priesthood authority, whether salvation is universal or, you have to, do some sort of things to be saved. And only some people are going to be saved. Is there a hell? Is there a devil? All these things would be answered in the book, and the book would convert people. So I don't want to get too far ahead of myself.
No, that's okay. In the original, let me pause you there and ask. So in our original panel, one of the things I pointed to try and really enunciate that point or bring that point to light was Doctrine and Covenants 19, where Joseph Smith basically builds a theological framework for even God or Jesus Christ misleading people, but doing it for good reasons, basically. As well as, I think the other story that you have pointed to before is him building the framework for justifying the killing of Laban. How did those, was I accurate in using those to help people understand your theory? Again, whether they want to accept it or not, to me is a completely different question. It's Aristotle said it's the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain an idea without necessarily adopting it. And I think that's one of the things we want to do here tonight is make sure that I presented an accurate version of the way people can understand kind of this theory. Did those feature in? Did I get that part correct?
Yes, that's one of the primary texts that, I call it kind of cognitive leakage, where Joseph Smith is advocating the philosophy that would justify pious fraud. So in the conclusion of my essay, I did write this. So if we could quote
you just
one of them.
Yep, you just tell me when you're ready, and I will pull that up.
It's up there. Should I double click it, or is that it? You got it?
Got it right there. Yep. You want me to read it?
Yeah, I don't see it on the screen.
I've got it. We may never know exactly Smith's reasoning, but we can at least say that if he wrote the Book of Mormon, became a prophet, and founded the church as a pious deception, it is evidence that he had the psychological means of justifying such acts.
So that's the conclusion I drew in 1998. Mm-hmm. I don't know where to go next, but maybe Sloan might have a question.
Well, let me see if I can accurately kind of steelman Sloan's position, and then we can get right into some questions. Sloan, if I remember your position on the first panel correctly, and obviously we had some discussions, privately before, your biggest concern that I remember was employing a double standard for Joseph Smith that we wouldn't apply to other people. And I think that's where I had done the best I could to try and give you the example of like the Laffertys as, pious murderers. And that might be actually, so let me ask you a two-part question. Number one, did I get that right? And then number two, it might be fun for us to ask Dan the question that you had for me. Like, do we have other examples of pious frauds?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. You, for the most part, got it right. Like when I was going through my deconstruction, one of the key terms was that I saw Joseph Smith like the Keith Ranieris, like the Warren Jeffs. Like I definitely saw a lot of his actual things that he did in the same vein or playing from the same playbook as some of those other cult leaders. And so I never heard pious fraud used for any of them. So when I've heard it used, I was like, okay, is this another title just for Joseph Smith, right? Or, he's king of the world, let's give him another title to put in his crown. Or is this something that like can be used more broadly? Is it something that, applies to others that maybe we need to use? And maybe it's the fact that we are only talking about Joseph Smith because we're all come from a Mormon background. But I think that was kind of where I came from was I think other people maybe without an LDS background would hear that and be like, well, why are we making this carve out for him, as opposed to, you know, just grouping him in with anybody else that they would group into, you know, whatever you want to call the Keith Raniere, the Warren Jeffs, all those of that same playbook. So that's kind of where I come from, where I fall.
Yeah. So Dan,
Yeah.
do you feel like you would apply that category to people outside of Joseph Smith? And if so, who have you pointed to?
Yes,
before?
but not the people that are being named.
Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Well, just because you're a cult leader doesn't make you a pious fraud.
Mm.
Okay. So Hitler's not a pious fraud. People were throwing around Hitler's name and they were comparing it to
That was Randy. That was
Randy.
Randy.
That was not me.
Randy. And I'm going, what did they do? What they have to commit a pious fraud. What is a pious fraud? It's a pseudepigraphical writing. It's relics, like I mentioned. Fake miracles is another one. So that means that this is a very select group that we're talking about. But there's a lot more than you really know about. You have to go through the medieval Europe was packed with pious frauds everywhere, with these bones of the saints, pieces of Jesus's thorny crown all over the place, pieces of the cross, nails, you know, the shroud of Turin, you know. All these kinds of things were pious frauds, and they're a lot more than you know. It's not just scripture. It's like certain edicts of the popes were forged in order to get some doctrine smuggled into the church. So we have pious. There are a lot of pious frauds. Joseph Smith's not the rare one. It's not just because we know Joseph Smith. There are some people around maybe that might be called pious frauds. There's some people that are actually think they do get revelations and write them down and publish them. There's some that are published, and there were a lot of. Joseph Smith wasn't the only prophet in the burned over district. There was a lot of prophets dictating books of Revelation. Okay, so that's one thing I would point out. I had some other observations that, especially with Randy.
So can I ask a follow-up question?
Oh, sure, go ahead.
So, and I think you said this in the comment, and to me it made sense. So the pious fraud isn't necessarily describing Joseph Smith and his entirety of his life. It was more the act of the Book of Mormon, right? That would be a pious fraud. The act of the Book of Abraham, his stones, like those sorts of things are the pious frauds, because is that accurate?
Yes, he's trying to give his ideas, his revelations, authority by calling on Abraham's name, you know. So instead of him just saying, if he just came up and he started teaching about pre-existence and Melchizedek priesthood and stuff, people wouldn't really believe him that much. He's just a farm boy. Nobody would read a book written by a farm boy. Okay, so, but they would read one translated by a farm boy that was written in ancient times by prophets, right? So Joseph Smith made his own authorities. He didn't in the beginning, he made his prophets up. But it's, you know, Lehi quoted Joseph, a record of Joseph in ancient times, talking about the latter-day prophet Joseph, right? Giving himself
the most
legitimacy.
It's the most specific prophecy I've ever read.
Yes, right.
I remember even, you know, because I don't think most people really get in depth on the scriptures until they're either like seminary age or even mission is when it really starts to click, right? Because you have so much time to read the scriptures away from someone else telling you, well, now read verse 5 and now skip down to verse 10 or whatever it is. And I remember the first time on my mission, because I think that's 2 Nephi 3, isn't it? If I remember correctly, the first time it really clicked with me, like, so wait, this scripture comes through Joseph Smith, and it's so specific. Like, he shall be called Joseph after his father, who is also called Joseph, who's called after me. I remember being like, that is very convenient prophecy. So if I'm understanding your response to Sloan's question, Dan, Joseph Smith perpetrated certain instances we could point to of pious fraud, but do you feel like the term applies to him generally outside of specific instances? Because that's more of what we talked about on the panel. Or do you think it's more appropriate to focus on, like, this instance was Joseph Smith was, engaged in a pious fraud. This other instance, he was engaged in a pious fraud. How do you feel the term should be used? As a general term for the entirety of Joseph Smith's life, or the majority of Joseph Smith's life? Do you also use it that way, I guess, is my question?
Somewhat. It doesn't. Does a pious fraud have to be pure in order to commit pious fraud? Does he have to be a righteous, perfect, spotless person in order to commit the fraud? Or does he just have to be misguided and think that God is telling him to do things? Sloan?
Yes, sorry, I feel like I have to raise my hand. So,
Cool.
in that example, right? So, if somebody believes their own, like what they're selling, right? That they're getting high on their own supply, like a Warren Jeffs, right? He had like scribes that were writing, like everything that he said, right? Because it was all of his revelations and all of those things, and and his authority, he's claiming it directly from priesthood line authority down, that they were secretly given that priesthood from John Taylor to keep plural marriage alive. Would a Warren Jeffs fall into the pious fraud? Would that also be something that he would?
Only if he knew he was not.
Okay.
Only if he did it consciously, knowing that it wasn't true.
I think
he probably is deluded or lying. He could be lying, but there are deluded people around that think that God is giving them revelations, and especially if you have a very loose definition of what revelation is, like Joseph Smith did. Privately, he knew he was just felt generally inspired to say things like patriarchs in the Mormon church, patriarchs, they're not hearing the words. They pray, they fast, and they hope they're saying the right things. Well, that's Joseph Smith. He was just like a patriarch on steroids kind of a guy, but he made everybody else think that it was literal, right? Because they needed to believe that in order to believe his revelations. So he doesn't want to be not heard. Okay, he has to be heard, and he has to win all the time, right? And so that's why he tells people, I'm just reading it from the stone, when he tells Oliver Cowdery something else, right?
Yeah, there is that contradiction in the direction he gives to Oliver Cowdery with the way he says he's experiencing it. One of the data points, Sloan, while you were rejoining us, one of the data points that I thought Dan shared that was interesting is one of the areas that he kind of built on what I said in our first panel is Dan believes not just that Joseph Smith did have these sincere religious beliefs that justified the deception, but also that Joseph felt like he was specifically authorized and maybe commanded, I think is the word you used, right, Dan?
Commanded.
To engage in that deception, because the ultimate, it really is like, if I understand you, it really is an ultimate like ends justify the means type of morality, which we see in Doctrine and Covenants 19, which we see in Nephi killing Laban, like that the greater good can justify Joseph Smith engaging in this deception for people's own good, similar to the model we see of Jesus in Doctrine and Covenants 19. Since you hadn't heard that, Sloan, I thought that might be a good data point to understand that Dan's view, at least, is that Joseph received that specific, or at least that Joseph believed he received that specific command. Obviously, I don't think any of the three of us believe Joseph Smith actually received that command.
Right. Well, before
that's important. That's important. Is Joseph Smith is not pious from our point of view, right?
Yeah.
But from his own point of view is what I'm trying to get at is what did he see himself as? What was his personal view of what he was doing? How did he see himself? He saw himself as pious, even though we don't.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm trying to drive at. That's why in my biography I was trying to achieve.
Which I was just going to say before I had to cut out and jump back in. 1998, I was a sophomore in high school, and in 2004, when you rewrote it, I was on my mission down in Paraguay, so deep in the jungles of the Amazon. But no,
that's
honestly,
that right there, Sloan, is why I've said Dan has forgotten more about Mormonism, I think, than I ever hoped to learn. So.
I am old.
100%. No,
Experience.
That's exactly how I feel.
Experienced, Dan.
But no, that's a great thing, and I understand Joseph believes he was pious, like that. I don't think that was ever like I knew what that meant.
He knew he was a sinner. I mean,
yeah.
He even said, "I am not a righteous man." He said that in public discourse. But he also said that prophets have passions, like Elias had passions, and they're not perfect.
Yeah, 100%.
I have one maybe specific question for you, Dan. Probably the thing I've noodled on the most from the first panel is I kind of conceded the Kirtland Safety Society as being something that I think falls on the other side of the line, where I can point to, I think it's more likely than not that Joseph Smith was self-interested and not doing that particular fraud or that particular activity based on his sincere religious beliefs. As I've thought more about that and even done some additional research, one of the things Stephen Murphy mentioned that I looked into more is that Joseph Smith was actually putting money into Kirtland Safety Society about 8 weeks before it collapsed, well after people knew that there were issues, and Joseph Smith would have known there were issues, and that's likely where the Kirtland Safety Society is headed. I guess my question for you is, did I concede that point maybe too quickly? And then my follow-up is, are there data points that you would point to where you feel like Joseph Smith was acting purely out of self-interest rather than because he thought he was justified? Or in your view, is it kind of like because his overall mission is justified, or he believes it's justified, really anything he does to further that overall mission can be called part of this overarching pious fraud?
And Sloan is itching to say something.
Well, no, I just had a question because I had recently listened to that chapter in No Man Knows My History, and it seemed, at least from that description, that God and his revelation, what he was giving to Joseph Smith, it seemed like that was his selling point. That was his, like, how he got in, and him putting his own money in is just another way to get more people to buy it and be like, look, it's good. I'm buying it. So let's all, buy it as a way to. So when I was listening, I was listening to the audiobook. When I was listening to that, it seemed to me that was more of a clear cut. That is Joseph working from a very personal gain, trying to use God as the hammer or the sales tactic to get people to buy in, that God revealed that it was going to be the notes from the Kirtland Safety Society were going to be more valuable than gold. All those things. And that's where I thought, okay, this to me was like clearly not something that he would be a pious fraud for. I think he knew he was deceiving people, and I don't think he even thought he was justified. It was just the sales pitch that he used was God to get people to buy in, is kind of how I thought about it.
Yeah. Yes. So he definitely oversold the Kirtland Temple project. But why did he start it? Was it some kind of Bernie Madoff kind of scheme? So it didn't go far enough for us to be able to figure out what his angle was going to be. It fizzled out right away. And a lot of members of the church were upset, and some of them said, well, why should we do this anyway? Joseph doesn't know anything about business. Right? So I think he genuinely he was young. He became a leader of a large group of people all of a sudden, and they needed property, land, and what was the solution? So this was a problem for him. He also was heavily into debt on the Kirtland Temple, which is one of the things I would ask some of the critics. I think Joe Smith had all these problems. I think he was a narcissist I wouldn't say he was a malignant narcissist like Dr. Anderson says, but he had narcissistic traits, which lots of leaders do. It's just kind of the territory. It's part of the territory, okay? And people are attracted to narcissistic leaders. People make leaders. If they didn't have leaders, people would invent them, okay? They need leaders. And so it's a symbiotic kind of creation. Okay.
Can I jump in here, Dan, and say one of the analog? I just want to echo what you just said, because one of the analogs I pointed to, and I know it's a fictional example, but there's tons of real world examples that we could use as an analog beyond Joseph Smith, is the Dune series, and like Paul Atreides as basically fulfilling. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Dune series, but the main character basically exploits these religious myths that have been seeded on this local population. He exploits those myths, eventually he ends up being the fulfillment of these prophecies. But what you just said about leaders and followers needing this symbiotic relationship, I think is one of the things that's really key to understanding this model of understanding Joseph Smith. I think we could look at contemporary political leaders, and we can see that sometimes it's not so easy to determine whether they I think there are leaders we could point to that know they lie, and they think those lies are justified because the ends justify the means. And I think that way of understanding Joseph Smith, which your theory is the best I've ever heard to recognize kind of that psychology, gets to that point. Sorry to jump in and interrupt you, but
no. So I go into vast detail on charismatic leadership and followers. And in the introduction to my second biography called the
Charisma Under Pressure.
Charisma Under Pressure. Charisma Under Pressure. So that's a long, involved story about charismatic leaders and followers. But to get back to the Kirtland Temple, is so we don't have enough information because it fizzled out too fast. But I believe he as a leader, he was under pressure to provide for his people. This was a scheme that he went for. And the Kirtland Temple and the Kirtland Bank. The Kirtland Temple put him into debt. And that's another question that critics need to ask is, if Joseph Smith was after, we have this sex, power, and
money.
And money. Okay, so if he was after money, why does he go into debt as soon as possible, way over his head into debt with the Kirtland Temple? Why didn't he just build a little tiny church and call it a day and keep the change, So that is a problem. Okay, slow.
Can I answer that question?
Oh, yeah.
The way that I see it is I see it more as is the juice worth the squeeze, right? So there's going to be he could go for little pittance as he's doing his treasure digging.
Oh, I see.
But then he's going to put a lot of effort, and his mark originally when he was making the Book of Mormon, translating the Book of Mormon, was
Martin Harris.
Martin Harris, yes. Martin Harris was his work, right? He was going to go into debt to publish it, and then they're going to sell the printing rights, right? The licensing rights to the Book of Mormon up in Canada, and that was going to be the payday. And he also wasn't going to have to go to court to defend himself. So to me, it seems like some of those things might just be okay, yes, I have to deal with this. I have to put this out there as a way to get a bigger payday, right? And so I have to build, if I have the Kirtland Temple built, more people are going to come, then I'm going to get but that's, again, just looking at it from if I didn't have scruples and was trying to get money out of people, you got to spend money to make money, right? But it's funny. Charisma.
That sounds like a very modern concept of business that I don't think existed back then.
Which is fair. I was going to say, I was thinking about how
maybe from an overall perspective,
because businesses go into debt when they start off all the time. So yeah, you're right. Maybe from an overall perspective, like my understanding, Dan, and just given how much work you've done on Joseph Smith's the entirety of Joseph Smith's life, didn't he? I mean, he died with a negative balance, right? So he was bankrupt.
Yeah, he
applied for bankruptcy. He and Hiram,
right,
under a new law that just came into existence at that time in Nauvoo.
So I guess from that perspective, Sloan, I would push back on that idea just to say, if he ultimately ends up bankrupt after multiple temple projects, it's a little difficult for me to see those as like just these token kind of things to continue the fraud going, because it doesn't seem like he ever really got that payday. Granted, he did, die in the mansion house. Randy continued to make that point. Not literally died in the mansion house, but died while living in the mansion house.
Yeah.
He definitely improved his financial station.
Yes.
But he still did die.
Here's my question, Dan. So you said that Nauvoo had just actually allowed for the bankruptcy, right? That was a new law, which
it's a new law, not in Nauvoo, but in the United States.
In the United States, okay. But he was basically in charge of the government at that time, and it would have wiped all of his debts clean, basically, right? They would have I would assume the judges would have been. Anyway, I could see it as, okay, now I'm going to wipe all my debt.
So
I have money and no debt.
Like,
right?
I didn't get that. Sorry.
I have all this money all these things that I bought on credit, right? And then they wiped my debt. Boom! I still have all the stuff. And he probably would not have had to pay it back if those lawyers and city councils and state government were all Mormons and sympathetic to him. So it still would have been a heads I win, tails you lose.
I mean, maybe not practically.
It's the hardest way to earn money, but
right.
That's true. But
so Kendall talked about the whole arc of Joseph Smith's life and stuff, but what I'm focused on is what made Joseph Smith move on in this direction. What made him move? Money digging obviously wasn't working, okay,
right.
And he was getting into trouble, and he needed to change, and this was one of the ways. But remember, in the 1826 trial, Joseph Smith Sr. said he hoped, according to William D. Purple, that his son would use his gift for a better cause, for a religious cause, more or less is what he said. And I think he took that as his cue. Now, what would be his motivation? Well, those three things that we were talking about. Okay, let's put up a graph here. Let's put up this one. Do you got it?
Yep.
So, wealth, power, and sex. Okay, there it is right there. So let's look at, we were talking about wealth. Okay, let's look at wealth. What happened there? Motivated by wealth. Okay. So is it, do you guys see it? I can't tell.
Churches are the devil.
Yep.
Yeah,
we've got.
So you write a book, and this book is not written to be a bestseller, okay? Because it's going to offend everyone that's a potential buyer, okay? So, and it's written to the Native Americans, right? They don't read English, Here we got this book. So he says all the churches are churches of the devil in this book. A Bible, we've got a Bible, there cannot be any more Bible. So he knows they're going to reject this thing by and large. And he says, I beheld the church of the Lamb of God, and its numbers were few. So he isn't really looking for, this will spread throughout the whole world kind of thing in this book. But even worse than that is the next slide. Well,
I can read this one for you, Dan.
Did it open?
It's going.
Oh, there it is. Okay.
There we go. You want me to read this one for you?
Yeah, sure.
Priestcrafts are that men preach and set themselves up for a light unto the world, that they may get gain and praise of the world. But the laborer in Zion shall labor for Zion, for if they labor for money, they shall perish.
Now, if you were after money, would you put that in your book? So you just made your job twice as hard, because people are going to be watching you and they notice that you're trying to acquire money, and then what? How long is this scheme going to work? So let's see.
One additional data point I'd give on that too, Dan, is we've recorded it, but it hasn't released yet. We did an episode on LDS Discussions where we talked about the history of tithing, and we talked about how there was talk of the church basically paying Joseph Smith and Oliver, if I remember correctly, and then that was basically like secretly agreed to, and then it was kind of voiced aloud to the rest of the membership, and then it was rescinded by the council that had made that decision. Does that tie in as well? Basically, that basically shows that the contemporary members of the church at that time, contemporary, understood those passages in the same way you're saying, that they would make it difficult to extract money out of them, right?
So, I don't think you're talking about the same thing. I'm not sure, but Sidney Rigdon and Joe Smith requested from the High Council to have a stipend, and they said no. And so they shut you. They cut you off. You couldn't even get a small amount of money so that you could, if you want more of the scriptures, then give us more money so we don't have to work as much, so we can produce the scriptures. So Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon could be Joseph Smith's scribe, and they would dictate more scriptures. And they said no. So you just set up a church government that blocked you from making any money.
Right. And I suppose I brought up that example and I didn't explain it very well. But
Is that
the reason
the
I
one?
bring up that is the one, yes.
Yeah,
but
okay,
the slides that I had reviewed with Julia basically said that initially the High Council, or the Council on the Disposition of Tithes, I guess it probably would have been, agreed to it initially, and then it was reported out of the council to the church membership, and it was the church membership that voiced so many concerns that then the High Council went back and rescinded that $1,100 a year salary.
Okay.
My sole point, regardless of which way it went, my sole point is just to say those verses that you've pointed to say these would make it really difficult for Joseph Smith to extract money. I'm just showing that the people that read this book initially viewed it the exact same way. Does that make sense? That they agreed, that they didn't believe he should be receiving money.
Right. So,
Sloan, any thoughts on that?
Why?
Yep.
Go ahead, Sloan.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, we have we could use the LDS Church with its $300 billion, $400 billion, and still the apostles get up there and talk about living humbly and being meek and all of that. We have our Joel Osteens, we have our Benny Hinn's, all of them, I'm sure, have given sermons about, being humble. And they've never.
They're called the prosperity gospel. It's open. If God will bless you, if you pay your tithes, God blesses you. God blesses me with money, and that shows that I'm favored by God by, living this great life. So they're not preaching the opposite. They're preaching, you know.
I mean, they're not preaching the meek shall inherit the earth, right? They're not preaching from, I mean, the Beatitude or the Sermon on the Mount.
That's the Sermon on the Mount, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually Beatitudes and Sermon on the Mount.
And it's the Beatitudes within the Sermon on the Mount.
The laborer is worthy of his hire, is the one they like to quote.
Mm.
There's everything you know. There's a passage for everybody in the Bible.
Exactly. There's contradicting passages. So
right. So what I was going to say was, right at the very beginning, before Joseph Smith dictated the Book of Mormon, so right during the period where he lost the 116-page manuscript, and he was about to dictate the Book of Mormon. He hadn't met Oliver Cowdery yet, but Martin Harris came down and visited him in Harmony after he lost the manuscript, and he wanted a greater witness. And what I'm alluding to is DNC 5, what we have now as DNC 5, dictated to Martin Harris in March of 1829. Oliver Cowdery comes in April. So Joseph Smith doesn't have a scribe yet. This revelation, Isaac Hale talks about this revelation in his statement, that Joseph Smith put the stone in the hat and dictated the revelation. And it said, if you want a greater witness, well, according to Isaac Hale, Joseph Smith said, you can have the witness of the plates, because Martin Harris is getting nervous about the plates and about the reality of the situation, actually, and he needs a greater witness. Although he would later say he saw the plates through a cloth, but that wasn't enough. He wanted to see the plates. So according to Isaac Hale, Joseph Smith told Martin Harris, follow my tracks in the snow and you will see the plates. The messenger will show you the plates. And Martin Harris did, and he saw nothing. Okay, nothing happened. And he went away all sad and everything. So, but before he left, Joseph Smith dictated this DNC 5 that said Martin Harris is a wicked man and he needs to repent, and you know it's his fault that he hasn't seen the plates, basically. And but the DNC 5 that we have now has been altered. Okay. And the original reading tells us a little bit about Joseph Smith's motivations at the time before he knows what's the contents is going to really be. Remember, if you know anything about Brent Metcalf's Mosiah priority theory, that Joseph Smith is dictating. He doesn't know what's going to happen, that Jesus is going to come and visit the Nephites. He doesn't know certain things. So that's why when he dictates Nephi, the small plates last, Nephi knows everything. But the prophets, Mosiah and Alma, they don't know anything about Jesus is coming to America. And so, his vision for his book, he doesn't know everything when he starts, and as he's dictating, it grows. His ambitions grow, you know. But what was the very first thought? His first mission for himself was just to dictate a book that would put down false doctrine and convert and stop the sectarian squabbling and convert people that were agreeing or disbelieving the Bible because it had so many faults in it, you know, from Thomas Paine, you know, showing all the discrepancies and contradictions in it. So that was it, that he would cause a reformation. So let's take a look at that DNC March 1829. Okay. So this is from the. This is actually the emendation. I put up the wrong one.
That's okay.
Sorry.
I like when we get to see the Dan stream. It makes me feel like we're in the celestial room together. All
we're going
us.
To number one. Okay. They came up in a different order for some reason. Okay.
Oh, weird. So this one, March 1829, and he has a gift to translate the book, and I have commanded him that he shall pretend to no other gift, for I will grant him no other gift.
So this is a very small goal compared to what later happens. You know, he's only to translate the Book of Mormon, and the Book of Mormon is going to convert people. And then they changed it to the emendation that I accidentally showed. So this is how they amended it for the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. And so who wants to read it?
Go for it, Sloan.
Kobe? Okay.
And you have a gift to translate the plates, and this is the first gift that I bestowed upon you. And I have commanded that you should pretend to no other gift until my purpose is fulfilled. For no other gift until it is finished.
So he's expanded, or hinted that there's going to be more to come, more gifts. Then there's another passage in the same revelation.
Let me pause you for 1 second, Dan, and see if I'm understanding the reason that that's significant. Because I think I tried to make this same case, I think, using a different example on the original panel. But when we see these evolutions in the ultimate scope of Joseph Smith's mission, that to me suggests that if he were a fraud from the beginning, just knowing he's setting this up for the three things we've talked about, power, sex, and money, that he likely wouldn't have needed to make these on the fly kind of edits and changes to the scope, because he would have set it up better in the beginning. Is that the reason that this matters as a data point?
Yeah, it's hard to accuse him of wanting to get into this for power or money, because he doesn't see beyond the book, and he doesn't know what the book's exactly going to say. And so along the way, it expands, and he sees that he can become a leader of a small group, not just reform the churches and cause the churches to stop squabbling, but he can actually form his own one true and pure church of God on earth.
I think we even see this in the Book of Mormon, in the sense that when you understand Messiah priority, or really regardless of if you understand Messiah priority, I remember even the first time I really started to appreciate the Book of Mormon and its structure, the sections in Mormon and Moroni, where you basically get all the material about actually setting up and administering a church, come out of basically nowhere. As the book is drawing to a close, as he's getting further on in the project, rather than having there are complete contradictions in the question of authority claims in the Book of Mormon when you look at Messiah compared to the end of the book, right? And I think that would be another data point that we could point to for this, right? That basically he doesn't know going in that he's going to create a church at all. Only as he's gathering this charisma, as he's gathering more followers, as people are becoming more interested in this project, basically as he starts to sense oh wow, this is actually working, I'm finding some success here, that the mission kind of pivots into not just dictating the book, but creating a church with the dictation of the book. Is that right, Dan?
Well, yes. He later, towards the end of the book, he starts putting in the ordinances and laying out what a church should be like. and how the discipline of the church and with Jesus comes and lays out some of that. And then the Book of Moroni says, oh, I forgot to mention, and then he adds the actual words for the, baptismal and sacrament prayers. So he's expanding and evolving right before our eyes in a way,
So Sloan, let me pause Dan for a second and say, when we look at that evolution, the example I used in our panel was the first vision accounts, that the evolution of the first vision account seems to align with Joseph Smith's kind of evolving theology. Does that, I guess, do you see that as evidence of Joseph Smith's sincere religious belief, or do you see it as a way that maybe that's just further evidence of him just being a con man or a fraud? I guess, is that convincing to you, I guess, is my question.
That's a great question. I actually see it kind of as both, and I know that's maybe the middle of the road type answer, but I see it as, I honestly think the first vision, he had some sort of born again epiphany, right? Like I think that actually happened, right? But then that wasn't like, a lot of people had that, so it wasn't meeting his expectations or his needs.
Right.
Book of Mormon, he translated the Book of Mormon. Yes, he was going to answer all the questions that he had heard listening to all the preachers around him, all the what do you call it, conflict that they had using the Bible, whatever. So I think that was part of his first calling. But I see the evolution as like, well, that didn't work out like I was supposed to, or, oh, there's a potential this is working better than I expected. I can get more from this. So then he pivots to the more like, okay, I believe this at first. However, money. Like I could use this for more, right? Then that's where I see the pivot as kind of like a maybe more nefarious, if that makes sense. The thing that
it's actually a lot bigger and a lot worse than money.
Okay.
Money is just the means to get what he wants.
Right.
What he wants is to set up a New Jerusalem, and he doesn't know it's Missouri at the time, an army and a nation. And he is actually an insurrectionist. Mm-hmm. He's a very dangerous person. Fortunately, the Missourians stopped his vision, got blocked. If he were able to keep on going with his vision, I don't know where it would have gone, but it doesn't look like a good thing to me. His idea is to remember what Jesus did, and he quoted Micah, in 3 Nephi 20 and chapters after that, that the believing Gentiles and the Indians would unite against the unbelieving, unrepentant nation. And they would go through like a lion and with the lamb and, destroy anyone that didn't believe.
Yeah.
Some people called Joseph Smith the American Muhammad. It's the Alacron or the sword. It's believe the Quran or die, that kind of thing. So
which goes
Joseph Smith's delusions about his grandeur were much bigger than a lot of people talk about generally nowadays. And I don't think they understand the Book of Mormon. I don't really know if they understand what they're reading, but it's pretty scary. And we live at a time right now where you can see what the potential was.
With the rise of Christian nationalism.
Yes.
You mean, Dan?
Christian nationalists, Joe Smith was way ahead of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I actually have posited like how interesting kind of almost like an Elseworlds multiverse kind of story it would be if Joseph Smith was never assassinated in 1844 and either won the presidency, which is its own kind of terrifying reality, or didn't win the presidency and moved with the Saints out west, and we basically had two different completely rival nations. One that's a complete theocracy, because that is what he was going for.
Exactly.
And yeah.
But
and they had territory to make a nation out there in the wilderness, out there. When they went to the Lamanite mission, they at first intended to build the temple in Indian territory, but they got thrown out of there, and they had to settle for Independence, Missouri.
Let me get your question, Sloan, and then I've got a follow-up on what Dan just said from Kendall in the chat.
Let's finish this thing here too. Don't forget.
Okay. Well, what I was going to say is I actually agree with you, but like most things within Mormonism, his grandiose schemes for power, it was line upon line, precept upon precept, right? Like it seemed like, hey, I had this thing and I'm going to answer all these questions. Oh, well, now that I've done that, it wasn't as good, but people are liking it. So maybe I now can become a leader of people, right? So it seemed like it progressed as he progressed. And we can see that throughout his life, right? Everything kind of progressed to Mad King era towards the end.
Yeah, I think he was responding to his followers. And he was providing what they needed for him to be their leader. Okay. Yeah. When he was too slow at responding to their needs, one of them at that time was tell us about the mysteries. Well, that's when Hiram Page stepped into the void and he started getting revelations about Zion and establishing Zion. And it was supposed to be established, in the Fayette area. That wasn't in Joseph Smith's plans. So he put down Hiram Smith. So that he was responding to his environment to control it and to put down any usurpers or potential challengers. And that required him to claim more authority. And it's like feeds itself kind of a thing. So he's a narcissist. He's prone to answering problems this way. And they need a leader. At first, we remember David Whitmer criticizing Joseph Smith for gaining all this power, because in the beginning it was supposed to be more of a Presbyterian kind of thing where it was a leadership by a group of elders, not a hierarchy like the Episcopal Church, right? So they were disappointed that it went that way, but that's my Charisma Under Pressure discusses why institutions have to react certain ways to keep alive, to keep its existence. Joseph didn't do away with charisma, but he corralled it and put parameters around it so people couldn't, so it wouldn't splinter. So charismatic authority is visions, miracles, dreams. Well, anybody can get a vision and start challenging Joseph Smith's visions, like Hiram Page, and people might splinter off because Hiram Page might be providing more what they want, answers to the mysteries, what we're going to do, what does God want us to do, and so I kind of lost my train of thought.
No, that's okay. I want to allow you to finish kind of that thought you'd started on the overall scope of Joseph Smith's mission.
Yeah.
I think you said you wanted to finish that thought.
So DNC 5, the other passage,
right?
Is, if the people of this generation harden not their hearts, I will work a reformation among them. He's not talking about a restoration of the true church with the apostles or anything like that. And I will establish my church like unto the church which was taught by my disciples in days of old. So what this is that he just like Alexander Campbell, he was trying to reform the churches and make them more biblical and get rid of the doctrines of men and, the precepts of men and the having the form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. Well, that was a description of Campbell. He wanted to change the form, but he didn't believe in miracles and gifts and revelations. Okay. So Joseph Smith was a charismatic version of Alexander Campbell in a way. He wanted to restore visions and revelations, and these people believed in that kind of thing. And so he attracted those kinds of people, and no wonder they had visions and revelations. They had them before they even came to Joseph Smith. Usually most of the Book of Mormon witnesses had their own personal revelations and visions before that, so they had an aptitude to be led to see things, especially with the charismatic leader, and they wanted to see things, so they're very willing. So
right.
It all
was
worked.
It Brigham Young?
It all worked out.
Was it Brigham that spoke in tongues?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and so did Joseph Smith.
Right.
On that same occasion.
On that same occasion. So let me ask this, Dan. So
yeah.
One of the things we talked about on the first panel is, we had basically two camps. We had this group that acknowledges that the best way to see Joseph Smith is this pious fraud theory, which, again, I view that as he is using this ends justify the means morality, and he believes that his deception, which he knows he's engaged in, your example of the buried feather on the treasure digs, I think, is a perfect example of this. He just thinks those things are ultimately justified. Then we had our more just fraud is sufficient, or charlatan, or con man, whatever we want to do. What do you feel like is the single biggest reason that you don't agree with that just fraud side of the panel? Like, what is the single best example?
Well, why do people use the term pious fraud? And it's what the aim is by doing the fraud. So the best way to know what Joseph Smith's motives are is to read the book. The book will tell you what he wants most done. Okay. And so that's why I've been talking about changing the churches, winning the argument. Basically, he's winning the argument by using revelation to himself. But it's not just a revelation, because if he just said, "Oh, I had a revelation," yeah, so did a bunch of other people too. So he says, "Well, no, this is a translation of a book, and the prophets actually are saying this thing in ancient times." So it's not really a revelation for his revelation, Joseph getting revelations. It was a translation of a document, a book written by ancient prophets, and that he used their authority, because he didn't have any authority. No one would believe him.
So it seems like you're saying both the Book of Mormon and then kind of the overall mission of the Book of Mormon, which then gets into this kind of larger scope that we've talked about. That's the single biggest thing that you're giving as the evidence for why pious fraud is a better descriptor than fraud. Is that right?
Yeah. What's the goal of Joseph Smith in dictating this book? And at first, so we were dealing with this. So sorry if I go back to this passage that we just read. It's a reformation, but how did they change that? It doesn't say that now, because no Mormon wants to read that Joseph Smith was wanting to reform the churches. They want it's a restoration. There's only one true church. And the concept at that time, this comes from Puritan times, this concept that the church, the saints are scattered in all the churches, the true saints.
Right.
And the Puritans wanted to gather the saints from all the churches to make a pure church of just the believers, and that nobody could take the sacrament, nobody can, come into the church unless you prove you had faith, a saving faith, and were worthy to take the sacrament. So they guarded the table, as they called it. And so even Hiram there's a letter where Hiram talks about the saints, the true saints coming visible, visible saints, okay, because they're hidden and they're invisible, and when they come out of the churches and join the Presbyterian, the Congregational Church, they become visible saints, and they're churches of the pure, and that's what early Mormonism tried to emulate, that part of the Puritan belief. Anyway, so it was a reformation among the churches, and they wanted them, like Campbell, to restore all the churches, not have one true church. And Joseph Smith was just a leader of a congregation or several congregations. It wasn't a denomination concept at first, until the Church of Christ was founded on April 6th, 1830. So they had meetings before that, and Whitmer talks about those kinds of meetings, and that they were in every sense a church even before the official organization. So let me give you the emendation for this passage. It was all cut out. Lots of words were cut out. And this passage kind of took its place. In this, the beginning of the rising up and coming forth of my church out of the wilderness. So the church was in the wilderness. It was gone. Okay. And the church came out of the wilderness and it was restored. There you are. So that's the complete,
and so
that idea.
Right. So if I'm understanding you, I just want to make sure I state it back to you and make sure I get it accurate. So when we look at all the ways that Joseph Smith's mission evolves and grows, whether it's the money, the additional power that he gets, I'm going to bracket polygamy and sex for a second, because that's a much harder, I think, argument from the sincerity side. But let's use just the power of money. It's that if we look at the totality of Joseph Smith's life, those things are being added to Joseph, but it's to further his overall religious mission that he's sincerely convinced of, and that we think that, or that you think that Joseph at least believed he was commanded to do. And that's where we see the importance of Doctrine and Covenants 93 and this religious justification. Is that, I just want to make sure I've gotten that correct.
Can you explain what your reference to DNC 93?
Because I think one of the things that's really interesting about this idea of just fraud or pious fraud is it's almost like there's a lot of talking past each other, right? And so, Kendall and Sloan and Randy could point to all of these different little data points and say, well, look, this is Joseph Smith got this personal advantage out of this situation. He got this personal advantage out of this situation. And I guess what I'm asking you is, it sounds like I'm hearing you say, yes, but those things are not necessarily inconsistent with him still being sincerely religiously motivated, because, and therefore pious under this definition, or a pious fraud under this definition, because the overall mission is larger, and it's about completing that overall mission. So when we look at the way he spent money, that the money is coming in, but it's ultimately going to this mission, not necessarily to Joseph Smith's self-interest. Does that make sense?
Well,
Can I ask it another way?
Yeah, please.
So from what it sounds like, I actually agree with all you're saying about reading his book and that being a pious fraud. And it seems like that's kind of what we're pointing to is the Book of Mormon. And I agree, when he started out writing the Book of Mormon, when he had his first vision or his born again experience, pious, right? And he knew that, yes, maybe he didn't have the plates, but he was going to do all this good for the people to bring them unto one community of Christ. Mm-hmm. I think what Colby, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think what you're stating is, Colby, is that's moving then to all the things he did later on as he moved from line upon line, precept upon precept, as he wanted more power and started doing more things, that that initial thing, the reason why we'd say over the course of his life he was pious fraud was because of that core starting of the Book of Mormon with his piety. Is that correct, Colby?
Yes. In fact, in the first panel, I said it's very important we look at the origin point, because I think there's a little bit of Joseph Smith where it's almost like he's the dog who caught the car, right? Like he started out
doesn't
with
know
this
what to
pie in
do.
yeah, he started out with this pie in the sky vision and thought that what he wanted to happen, if you read the Book of Mormon, to Dan's point, was never going to happen. But then it started to happen. He started to gain that charisma and started to revise kind of what his role was. Yeah.
Well, also, yeah, it's that the dog analogy is good because the circumstances demanded the responses that he gave. He needed more power to hold the church together because it would split. And so was it because he was a narcissist and he likes power, or was it because he wanted to create this perfect society where everybody could live in unity and have these religious experiences together? It's hard to tell. Maybe it's some of one and some of another, both.
But that example right there, Dan, did just answer the question that I was trying to ask, which is, I think there's a way to look at even these things that might look like Joseph Smith benefiting from some of the decision points that he made, that we could point to and be like, oh, those better fall on the fraud side of the line rather than the sincere side of the line. And I think one of the things that tonight's discussion has kind of brought out for me is I actually think you can even see those things on the fraud side of the line if Joseph Smith legitimately believes they're ultimately justified to further this calling that he felt like he had from God. It's almost like maybe he could justify all of this under that theory. I really don't know. Like, I think we all would admit we really can't know. We can just look at the best little indications that we have in the data that we do have access to.
So let me show one slide. I think
Great.
Will tell us a little bit about Joseph Smith's philosophy. Do you see that?
Yep,
there?
Got it. Let me read this one for us.
Yeah.
This comes from the Happiness Letter. That which is wrong under one circumstance may be and often is right under another. Whatever God requires is right, no matter what it is, although we may not see the reason thereof till long after the events transpire. And I think we can even get this more specific by looking at the example we looked at in the first panel in Doctrine and Covenants 19, which is specific to deception. It literally is God, supposedly God, according to Joseph Smith, saying that God misleads people about the consequences of their choices, whether they're eternal or not eternal, for people's own good.
Right. So another chart, we're outlining Joseph Smith's epistemology in a way. Let's see. Let's see. Where did it go? Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
Not that. I lost it. Oh, there it is. Okay, sorry.
No, you're good.
So these are Joseph Smith's beliefs. One, he secretly believes in universal salvation, despite what the Book of Mormon says. That's DNC 19. Two, he believes the term eternal damnation is God's pious deception, meaning God makes us believe or misleads us into believing that if we sin, we're going to be eternally damned, and that's not what it really means. And so the Book of Mormon itself is using misleading language this DNC 19 is a revelation given in March 1830 to Martin Harris to convince him to pay for the printing of the Book of Mormon to sell his farm finally. And Martin Harris is a universalist, and he's hesitating because of the content of the Book of Mormon is not what he expected. And so this helps him accept that the Book of Mormon is just using harsher language to convince people to repent and not use universalism as an excuse and perish. And the revelation even says not to let other people read this revelation, because they'll read it and perish. They don't understand the meat of the gospel. They need only milk right now. So then he believes some sins are according to God's will. That is 2 Nephi 2:25, where it's better that one nation perish, or one man perish, than a whole nation perish in unbelief, which is kind of a paraphrase out of the Gospel of John. You know,
it's also funny because where the story ends, even though they get the book, is they literally dwindle and perish in unbelief anyways,
yes,
even though they have the book.
Womp womp.
Yeah. So Nephi is hesitant. He says to the Spirit, he argues with the Spirit, I've obeyed the commandments all my life. He doesn't want to do it. And the Spirit argues with him and gives him that passage. So he crosses moral lines to fulfill God's commandment. And God doesn't give commandments that he himself doesn't provide the means of fulfilling them. Mm-hmm. This I believe is Joseph Smith. I think he's in tune with this kind of wrestling and thinking because of what he wants to do, what he's doing. So it's a divine command theory being applied to Joseph Smith's early life. I'm saying that he had this philosophy all along, justified a lot of things this way. He believes God sometimes commands his servants to lie, like with Abraham. The book of Abraham is unique in that it has God telling Abraham to tell Sarah to lie to the Egyptians so that they won't kill Abraham. So Joseph Smith brings God into the deception.
Right, because in the book of Genesis account, Abraham and Sarai lie, but there's no specific commandment from God that they lie. So there's a different interpretation if you just look at the Old Testament. Maybe they just are the ones who lied and God still chose them to be prophets. But yeah, Joseph Smith does completely change that. He does the same thing with polygamy, right? Like there's no commandment in the Bible. There's no commandment in the Bible to Solomon, David, any of those guys about taking extra wives. Instead, it seems to be a cultural practice. Well, maybe I'm wrong about that.
Of course, this is my arguments with the polygamy deniers. There, in the early Mormon polygamists like to quote where Nathan tells David that, didn't God give you your wives? Mm. And why do you want this? You're trying to take this
from
Bathsheba. Yep. Yeah, he only has one little lamb, So there is that. Anyway.
Well, let me ask this.
And then he believes in moral relativism, which is what we just read from the letter.
Right. Let me ask this question: what do you feel like is the strongest reason? Like, why not just use fraud? Like, what is lost in meaning and in communicating about Joseph Smith's life if people just use the term fraud? Because my position has been that understanding kind of this pattern that you've talked about, this symbiotic relationship that can happen between a charismatic, narcissistic leader and their followers is just like the Laffertys being pious murderers or doing it out of sincerely motivated religious beliefs. It helps us understand a different category of danger. And I'd like to get your take on what is the single biggest thing that we lose if we just use the term fraud. Like, why did you land on pious fraud or think that that term fit Joseph originally? And what's lost if we don't use that term?
Well, so I was writing a biography of him, and I wanted to understand his world. And so I had to listen, read his Revelations, read his Book of Mormon. We don't know much about his early life, so you have to mine the Book of Mormon, I believe, to see what Joseph Smith values, what he believes, what his assumptions are. I also put together the family dynamics, psychodynamics in a way, where Joseph Smith fit as the savior of the family. There's a lot. The Book of Mormon tells us a lot about Joseph Smith, and a lot of you have to really listen carefully to what is being said and apply it with an eye towards, he's accidentally revealing more about himself than he knows or knew. He didn't know it was so revealing. Probably he says things every now and then that are accidental disclosures,
right?
Which are important to. Those are very important insights that you get about a person when they make these accidental revealments,
right?
But so why just a fraud? Well, because there are these people, like you did say in the last episode, that we need to understand these kinds of people because they are very dangerous, and there's people that are highly susceptible to this kind of leadership. I believe in an anthropological way that humans are hardwired for belief in God. And, it works on a bell curve, of course, but some are, in ancient times, we followed these kinds of charismatic leaders. They kind of, they have likened Beatlemania to the kind of mania that was attached to these ancient leaders. A lot of them were military leaders, but popes used to be treated like the Beatles, like this hysteria, this group hysteria kind of situation where, and it's very irresistible. And right now we are experiencing one of those personality cult situations on a large scale. In ancient times, the church and military leaders were united. They made, the church coronated the kings, right?
Right.
We'll coronate you if you, give us this power, right? And they had this thing, and they're trying to bring that ancient way of thinking back,
right?
So it's a pre-modern mindset in a way. Pre-modern. It's how humans behaved in ancient times and how they chose their leaders. And like I said, there's some people are very susceptible to following these kinds of leaders.
Right.
And it becomes very dangerous situation sometimes.
Yeah, so it sounds like I'm hearing you say you agree with my point about the danger, that it's a different category of danger than just a fraud, and that it's important, particularly since you coined the term or used the term in reference to Joseph Smith biography, to understand Joseph Smith through the lens of Joseph Smith. So it sounds like the reason you've landed on that term, even though I think we all would acknowledge it's an imperfect term, right? Because the man himself is an oxymoron and a paradox.
Mm-hmm.
It gives us greater understanding of his motivations, and that it can help us understand kind of the unique kind of category of danger. Let me get Sloan in for a second, because I know he's going to disagree with that. Sloan, I'm going to just allow you to push back on that, ask any questions you want of Dan, and then I have a few that I have queued up to ask in addition.
Yeah, so I actually get what Dan is saying and what it's come from, and from what it seems like he keeps going back to is the Book of Mormon as a pious fraud. And to me, that 100% makes sense. It's like it was sincerely believing it, and the stuff maybe later on in his life was more. I guess I just have a couple questions for Dan, if that's okay. So the first one would be,
please.
If you were outside of Mormonism, would you see, let's say, not writing a biography about Joseph Smith, would you see Joseph similar to other cult leaders, cult of personality? Would you put them in that same category, or is Joseph? I'm like, if you put yourself into an outside of Mormonism person, how would they see Joseph Smith, generally speaking?
Well, it's a cult of personality.
Cult of personality. Okay.
It was. Well, he was alive.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wouldn't say Mormonism now is a cult. They're cultish, but so are evangelicals in my mind.
Yeah.
So I don't see much difference between evangelicals mindset and Mormon mindset. They're just different sides of the same coin.
I mean, I was touched under a shield without my knowledge beforehand in the temple.
Oh yeah, okay.
So there's a little bit more culty things. The second question that I had. So you had brought up in your comment the what was it? Sincere charlatan, which actually to me seemed more along those lines. In your mind, is there a difference between like a sincere charlatan and a pious fraud, or are they both kind of terms that are getting at the same idea that you're looking for? Well,
Lawrence Foster, I don't know if you ever heard his name. He wrote a book on sexuality and religion, and he, in the subtitle, names the three groups, and one of them's Mormonism, and the Shakers and Oneida Commune. Well, so he likes the term sincere charlatan. So I used pious fraud because it was the term of the day, and in the struggle with the deists, Thomas Paine coined the term, according to Google. Thomas Paine, in his Age of Reason and Common Sense books, used the term pious frauds. That's always been a lot of scholars have understand this term. I mean, it's hard to understand. It's hard to put the two things together. How can you be? It's sort of like, can you understand the terrorists? Can you understand Al Qaeda calling themselves religious and all the atrocities that they commit? Religious people commit atrocities all the time. How does that work in one head? You know what I mean? So it's very hard to grasp, but we know it exists, kind of a thing, you know? We know people do this, but you'll never understand it. I mean, not really, because you're not wired that way. Some people are. And part of it's cultural too. But Mormons have lying for the Lord. You know, a lot of people did that, lying for the Lord or whatever. And people that committed the atrocities that, what is it? John D. Lee, Mountain Meadows, those people.
Mhm.
I mean, there are ancestors right there doing it, you know. So,
What's another question you had, Sloan?
do you
I
want
mean,
to
those
go
are
through
kinda-
the sex thing?
Go through what?
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
figure out, was Joe Smith motivated by sex?
Yeah, because we've
Oh,
talked about
That's the
money
only
and
one we
we've
haven't talked about.
Yeah, we've talked
And
about
it's-
money and power. Let's talk about
It's
sex.
a favorite. You know, he's a polygamist. Of course, that's what he was after, you know. But I think maybe we'll just like deconstruct that a little bit.
Sure.
Real fast.
You did bring up the happiness letter earlier, and I
Yeah,
will say
that-
that was one of the things I'd call it my catalyst to my exit out of Mormonism, was learning. I had heard it quoted from the pulpit. I actually heard it from religion professors at BYU that were quoting from it, but never gave the context of it being a letter to Nancy Rigdon to basically try to entice her to be one of his polygamist harem. And so finding that out, I'd say, was one of my catalysts. And that was kind of where I saw, oh, he, to me, was like other sex cult leaders. It was like clicked in my mind. I was like, oh my goodness, I had seen the Vow, I'd seen Keith Raniere documentaries, I'd seen Warren Jeffs, and that was kind of my, oh no, that's where I put him in that same ilk as them. And that's where I sat on my couch and I was like, oh no, my life is ruined. I'm going to lose my wife and my children and all of that. So that's personally what kind of brought me to this whole discussion, was that feeling of getting into this with the happiness letter. So yeah.
All right. So sort of like with the money, if you look at the Book of Mormon, what does it say? It doesn't exactly set up Joseph Smith for sexually abusing his followers, unless he wanted to make the job harder as a challenge or some kind. No, sorry, I put up the wrong one. Here we are. Sorry.
You're good. I'll read this.
Everybody knows this one.
Yeah.
Everybody knows this.
Many of the daughters of the Lamanites have they taken prisoners, depriving them of that which was most dear and precious above all things, which is chastity and virtue. For I, the Lord, delight in the chastity of women.
So that's going to make your job harder to seduce some of your female followers when they read this in that book. And then especially when you set up the high council as, excommunicating and trying people like crazy for sexual sins. So there's that. Let's see. I think that's it. Well, so also, so he has the other passage in the Book of Mormon is against polygamy. You know, you have this big passage like no polygamy, and it has a little loophole in there, but it's really not a loophole in a futuristic way, but one for it's actually the loophole that was created was alluding to the patriarchs.
Right.
Because David and Solomon, they are bad. And then he doesn't mention anything about the patriarchs at all. But he makes this statement about unless God commands, and when God wants to raise up seed, he will command his people. Well, that alludes to Abraham raising up seed to the Lord to fulfill the promise that he would be a father of all nations, right? And so he took his handmaiden and Sarah, the law of Sarah. Sarah gave her handmaiden to fulfill the promise. So that was a subtle apologetic for why the patriarchs lived polygamy. but that polygamy is still not right. So when God commands, it becomes right.
That's really interesting to me, Dan, because one of
Yeah.
the things I've thought about with that, I'll just call it the loophole in Jacob 2,
Yeah.
is that is not the position I would have expected from Joseph Smith, because Methodism was completely, no, we don't believe in any form of polygamy or alternative marriage structures, whatever you want to call it. But seeing it as not future proofing, but actually back proofing, going through and creating this loophole for the patriarchs is actually a really useful explanation for why that's in there. Because that kind of has, as I've been talking with Ganesh Cherian about finding Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon, that's something I've been thinking over that I haven't really been able to explain, but I think you're likely right, because we know Joseph Smith does that at other parts in the Book of Mormon. I think the whole Korihor story is actually directly trying to counter Thomas Paine's Age of Reason. The idea is in Thomas Paine's Age of Reason that Korihor is basically an analog for Thomas Paine. So that's a really interesting insight.
So yeah, why doesn't he mention the patriarchs? There's no patriarchs in that chapter 2 there mentioned at all. Why just David and Solomon? So that's why they're mentioned, but doesn't want to draw attention to it, So you wouldn't. So he has that passage. He's blocked himself off from doing a polygamy thing, and So the sexual thing, though, is a reversal, which he does. If God commands, then God can change the law, the rule. So I believe, and of course he's motivated probably by sex. I mean, I'm not going to discount that. I mean, that's too obvious, right? But I believe he had a way of justifying it in his own mind, which is he prayed about it. He finally came to the conclusion about the patriarchs and tried to work something out. And then God gave him the answer that it was okay, that, but it has to be revealed. God has to unite. What God does join together, let no man put asunder thing. But how he worked that out in details and in real life was his own doing. And he believed he could lie about the sword, the angel with the sword. He lied about that several times.
So I guess my question on that is, so the one thing that at least from a Mormon side, is David, because he when Doctrine and Covenants 132 comes out, right, he has the Law of Sarah and all that, and the one thing that I remember is David and Bathsheba. That's a big no-no, right? He sent Uriah to war, kill him, take Bathsheba. But then, how does Joseph, I guess, in your mind, how does he justify sending men off to missions and taking their wives behind their back, right? As far as that's very similar to what David did. And maybe that's part of it. And then the second thing that I had was, I think sex was part of polygamy, but I also think power was. It was a consolidation of power, because you bring people into his little secret group, right? And then they had their secret, and it bound them together, and that would be
I believe it was about power, more about power than sex. That's why he married other men's wives. Okay, there was a
That's
power
what I
over
think.
them. Yeah,
That's what I think too. Is I think Joseph Smith, like most narcissistic leaders, Joseph Smith found a lot of satisfaction in seeing people willing to capitulate to his demands simply because he was the one who made the demand. And I think oftentimes, of course, it's also probably about the sex, but I actually think it was more motivated by the loyalty and almost like the willingness that those men were, the willingness that those men had to follow Joseph to that extent. I almost think he got off on demanding that and having it pay off.
Instead of church broke, they're Joseph broke, right? Like they'll give up to their wives or their 14-year-old daughters.
It was all about control.
Yeah.
Right.
Control. And I think part of it in Nauvoo, especially, I mean, he had Fanny Alger in Kirtland, but in Nauvoo, he went kind of accelerated. I think a lot of it was a reaction to being in prison for 6 months, that he was powerless, and it changed him. His incarceration changed him, and he came into Nauvoo super concerned about his safety, power, exercising power. And I think part of it was his sexual abuse of his female followers, and all these tangled associations with men and their wives. Most of the first wives were married. Now, so he was having trouble with Emma. We all know about that. And then when he dictated D&C 132 in July of 1843, it had a part in there that talked about virgins, 7 virgins. That was telling Emma that he was giving up his polyandrous marriages. He repented of those, but not of polygamy as a principle.
Well, let me ask a few more questions I solicited ahead of time, Dan.
Okay. We can't get any off of our chat?
I've done a few that I saw. Let's see here. So this is separate from the Pious Fraud, but I know you've got an interest in this, Dan. Martin Harris said the Book of Mormon was an anti-Mason book. I'd be curious to hear the panel's analysis why, since the church eventually became pro-Masonry. I know you've done videos on this before, right?
Well, it didn't become pro-Masonry. That's kind of a misinterpretation of borrowing Masonic ceremony. But Joe Smith, at the same time, criticized Masonry as being an apostate endowment, an apostate priesthood. So, yeah, Martin Harris said everyone saw the anti-Masonic elements in the Book of Mormon. There's a lot of quotes of whoever commented on the Book of Mormon and Masonry mentioned the anti-Masonic part, but it's not just anti-Masonic; it's anti-Andrew Jackson. Right, is the larger. It's rejecting Jacksonian America because Jackson was too secular. Right, he was also a states' rights guy, not a federalist.
Right.
So the Book of Mormon. If you forget the God of this land, you shall be swept off. You remember that in Ether. So it was a warning that at the same time it said that if you forget the God of this land, you'll be swept off. It also said that to beware of the secret combination that is among you.
Right.
And if it gets the secret combination, just one, not plural anymore. That this is to warn them not to let it get above them and destroy the liberty of America and all lands. So Jackson was a Masonic king in Tennessee, and so a lot of people feared Jackson, that he was going to be a king. They made cartoons of him dressed as a king, and he was also a feared military leader. He the hero of the War of 1812, of New Orleans, the Battle of New Orleans, and did things that were illegal, unconstitutional. And whatever he needed to do, he did, and then inquired afterwards about their legality. He did what was needed at the time. And so people feared him. He was also known as the guy that hung 4 men in Florida, which wasn't an American territory. So he was fighting the Seminole Indians and went into there, and there were 4 guys that he accused of being traitors because they wouldn't fight. One was even a minister, and he was exempt, but that didn't seem to save him. He had him hung. So he was that kind of feared leader, but he was loved by the masses, the not the elite, out of New
Right.
England.
Kind of like
Jackson
a
was from-
mobocracy. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the elite in the New England states, that's where it came from before Jackson was the first Western president to be elected. And they feared the masses, the mob. When Jackson was inaugurated, the mob descended on the White House, and that's how they described these mob, and they tore things up and had a riot kind of party welcoming him into office. And this was all happening, the inauguration, in April of 1829. They had a different time for inaugurations than we do. So this was very much happening, and Western New York especially was the hotbed of anti-Masonry. It's where William Morgan famously was disappeared, believed to have been murdered by the Masons, because he was going to reveal their secrets. Actually, his book was published the year after his death. And so the Book of Mormon is very has a lot of anti-Masonic rhetoric in it. And many people, E.D. Howe, Alexander Campbell's 1831 was the first to mention the Masonic aspects of the Book of Mormon. So Joseph Smith actually changed on other things than Masonry. He changed on how many persons are in the Godhead. He changed, baptism for the dead kind of went against, his 1836 statement, revelation on seeing Alvin in heaven, and that all those who had good intentions are going to be saved through Christ's atonement. There was no need for a baptism. So that was just the line upon line thing.
Yeah. He just evolved over time. I've got a few more from our live chat. Is it correct to sum up, Dan, that Joseph thought he was a pious fraud, but we aren't saying he was pious, but an obvious fraud? That question's from Ursus. Yeah.
I would agree.
So really,
that's I'm talking about Joseph Smith's
Go ahead.
perceptions of himself, which were distorted and twisted, and he built his church on a sandy foundation, basically, which was his narcissism. But we wouldn't think we're not under an obligation to see him as being pious.
Yeah, and I guess I look at this slightly differently in the sense that I see pious fraud, again, as a term of art, incorporating, like, pious fraud is not different from fraud. Pious fraud to me is a smaller subset of frauds. So I kind of just disagree with the framing of the question, that I don't think, I think it's both things at the same time, basically, that he's a fraud, and that the reason he's doing the fraud is because he's motivated by these sincere religious beliefs. Sorry, Sloan, I saw you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
I was going to say there was another question that I actually liked, and I would like to hear Dan's response. This is the one from Kendall.
Is it this one from Kendall? Oh yeah, I was going to
how much
Yeah. So if you had a magic wand,
not
Oh,
that
not
one.
that one?
Actually,
Oh,
two
sorry.
above. So it was. How do I scroll up in the chat?
how much do you think
There it is.
this one? How much do you think the financial anxiety and family religious contention as a boy contributed to Joseph's goals and aspirations?
Okay, before I get to that, keep it on the screen though.
Yep.
Because I
got
might
it.
have to reread it after I'm done.
You got it.
The Randy Bell last time said, no one in the law, no one cares what your motivations were, which is not really true. But
yeah, I didn't push back on that in the moment, but that's absolutely not true. There are complete differences in categories of crimes based on intent.
Yeah,
yes.
But and in discretion, in sentencing and things like that. But he said the law doesn't care, but my response is that a biographer does.
Sure.
A biographer does. There's a difference between judging Joseph Smith and indicting him, and debunking him. We all debunk him in a way, but you want to go a little further than that and try to understand him on his own terms. And I think everyone basically has said they agreed somewhat with that idea that we're not just writing like a biographer writing a debunking book. Historians don't do that. And I go further than most historians will. If you've read John Turner's book, you can see he shies away from doing any of that kind of stuff. Yep. And so I go further because I'm unfettered. I don't belong to the academy, and the academy are financially motivated because basically teaching's a business, and you gotta have people come into your classes, and you can't be debunking religious people. And anthropologists don't debunk because they want permission to dig, here or there, and they don't want to debunk people's religions and get locked out. So, but I have no ties to anything, right? I'm an independent scholar, okay, and so I can do anything I want to do, and so I do.
It's one of the things I love about having this channel is I can do a great discussion like this with a scholar like you, Dan. Even though you're not in the academy, I still consider you a scholar. And then I can watch bad creationist propaganda with my friend on a different day. Like that's the great thing about having that independence. I completely agree with you there.
So the financial anxiety of the family. I think Joseph Smith was more distraught over the death of Alvin and what that meant to his parents. They were, okay, Joseph Smith was a religious zealot. He wasn't like an atheist pretending to be religious to get money. That just totally misses Joseph Smith altogether. He was a religious zealot, and zealots cross lines and become indistinguishable from the thing that they're fighting a lot of times. So now the Smith family were united when Joseph Smith had his first vision. I'm going according to the 1832 account mostly. He wasn't struggling over which church is true. He knew that they were all false. And that was in accordance with both parents at the time. They all said that Joseph Smith Sr.'s dreams, showed that the religious world were spiritually dead. Okay, there was nothing, no spirit, nothing there, and so when Joseph, according to the 1832 account, which is already I believe, evolved, but he wanted to know if he was saved and how he could be saved, since there were no true churches on earth. What need he do? And in the 1832 account, Jesus says you don't have to do anything. All you have to do is have faith. no wonder they don't want us to read that version, you know. And Jesus confirmed his belief that none of the churches are true. So then Alvin dies, and Alvin hadn't been baptized, but none of the Smith family were baptized. None of the Smith children were baptized. The parents were, but they didn't have their children baptized. And that shows you, really, they were committed to the idea that they didn't need baptism. All they needed was their faith and belief in the Bible. And when Alvin died, according to William Smith's account, the minister, Reverend Benjamin Stockton, preached the funeral sermon and implied that Alvin had gone very strongly, William said, that Alvin had gone to hell. Okay. And that made Joseph Smith Sr. angry. He refused to go to that minister's church anymore. That was it. So when Lucy started going, and more or less she needed community. Maybe she was even impressed by this no baptism. Alvin wasn't baptized. What about his salvation thing? And the children started going. And what did that say about Joseph Smith's dream visions? What? Lucy didn't believe the dream visions anymore? You know, that wasn't good enough. You're kind of questioning the vision, sort of like Sariah with Lehi, right?
Or Lot's wife.
Yeah. So then she joins the church, has 3 of the older children join the church. Joseph Smith Jr. Sides with his father, like Nephi, and supports his father's dream visions. And so the family's divided religiously. All of a sudden, which church is true becomes a question in the Smith household. Not before, not in 1820. That wasn't the question. So you can tell that Joseph Smith is pulling elements from the 1824-25 revival time period in their lives and pushing it back to 1820. The revival starting with the Methodists, well, that happened in 1824 and 25 with the preaching of Reverend George Lane, who I'm related to, by the way. And so Joseph Smith, I believe, his key anxiety was his family being split. And Lucy tries to downplay it in her history, makes it sound sort of, sterile, We would be up late discussing all manners but religious, whatever discussions they were having, and makes it sound like very, non-threatening. But I believe it was very, very threatening to the family, and some of that shows up in Joseph Smith's story of Nephi and his family. And that's why Lehi has a dream just like, or very, very similar to Joseph Smith Sr.'s, but it's different in a very important way. And that is that Nephi brings out that Lehi in his Tree of Life vision didn't notice that the water of the stream was muddy and that it represented the depths of hell. Well, that was Joseph Smith Sr. didn't believe in hell. Joseph Smith Sr. was a universalist and a Unitarian who didn't believe Jesus was God either. That's why the Book of Mormon emphasizes Jesus is the eternal God. So Joseph Smith is trying to convert his father to Christianity, to believing that Jesus was God. But because Joseph Smith Sr. believed in universal salvation, he was probably a little lax on the commandments. He drank too much also. And I'm sure Lucy made him aware that that wasn't really godly like. Here's this dreamer, drinks too much and imagines this or that. And so I believe Joseph Smith was trying to resolve the family tension, which he succeeded in doing. Right? That was a success with the Book of Mormon. They united behind Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. And
Right.
Joseph Smith Sr. was converted and gave up his universalism. That's why the Book of Mormon is so anti-universalist. I mean, the Order of Nehor, these guys didn't believe in that. They believed that all souls would be saved.
Right.
And so the Order of Nehor runs through a large portion of the Book of Mormon, and Alma's preaching with Coriantumr is all about Coriantumr is a universalist also. So Joseph Smith has his father. He has Martin Harris as a universalist, and the Book of Mormon's heavily laden with anti-universalist rhetoric. It borrows right from the arguments that the universalists used in Joseph Smith's environment, like the sin against the Holy Ghost being unforgivable. Well, how can you have universal salvation and that passage be true? That's one of the key passages. Well, Alma quotes it, even though it hasn't even been written yet, because it's in the New Testament, right?
Right.
And he quotes that to Coriantumr, whatever 100 years before Christ. So those arguments that the Book of Mormon presses against universal salvation is the very ones that are being said by the anti-universalists. And then he switches with DNC 76, right? The 3 degrees of glory. That's just the opposite. That's universal salvation, more or less, except for the sons of perdition.
Right.
So he tries to work out a system, instead of lying to people that you're going to be damned for eternity. He can now have an incentive to obey the commandments in having 3 destinations for the souls of mankind. So he doesn't have to lie to coerce people to be obedient. Because if you believe in universal salvation, why obey the commandments? It's no big deal. I'll be saved in the end anyway, right?
Right.
But if Joseph Smith privately believes that is true, that's one thing that helps him commit his fraud.
Right. Coming back full circle to that DNC 93 reference. Yeah. Let me ask, I know it's getting late.
You're not getting
for Dan.
tired?
No, I know it's getting late for Dan,
Hearing
and
me talk? Okay.
I am no. I love hearing you talk, Dan. I would listen to you for 5 hours.
Can I just say one thing?
Oh yeah, of course.
I was just going to say, he said, a dreamer who drinks too much. And I think he just described most of the best writers. That's all I'm saying.
That's right. That's right. So I'd kind of like to wrap up with this question, because I think it's an interesting way. I know it's getting late for Dan. I'm also about to turn into a pumpkin.
I'm okay. I'm okay.
Oh, okay. Well, let me ask this question.
It's only
then.
9 o'clock here. So.
Oh, it's only 9 o'clock. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me ask this question that Kendall put in the chat, because I think it's an interesting one. If you had a magic wand, what is the first thing that you would will that the people hero worshiping Joseph Smith would know and take more seriously? And one thing for the people who think he's an absolute irredeemable villain. So this is kind of like, what did believers probably miss about Joseph Smith, and what do critics or ex-Mormons sometimes also miss about Joseph Smith? It's the way I would interpret it.
Hero worshiping Joseph Smith. Okay. So I see. Gosh, I wish I had that magic wand. Because I find it very difficult to get them to listen. So you would need a magic wand. So, well, it's sort of like I think it's more about them than it is Joseph Smith.
Mm.
Okay, it's their need. Why do you need a hero, and why do you need a villain? Why do you need these simple caricatures of humans? This is the world is full of complexity and complex people. We're all complex to a certain degree, but Joseph Smith was very, very complex guy. I've tried to get into the way he rationalized his actions. So that's what I would say. It's a lot. It tells us a lot about ourselves, of how we interpret Joseph Smith and other people.
Yeah,
Amen.
if I can jump in, one of the things that has been really interesting about this entire discussion, not just tonight, but kind of the earlier panel too, is just to your point, Dan, is there's an element of me, I guess, that can understand the pious fraud point of view of Joseph Smith, because I can see an analog in my own life. Obviously, I didn't do a lot of the things that Joseph Smith did as far as being motivated by money, sex, and power, but I can recognize times in my life as a believer where I knew that I wasn't. It's so complicated. There are times in my life, especially on my mission, where I knew that people were believing things I was saying that I also believed were true, but in a way they were believing them to a degree, like literally, that I knew wasn't accurate. And I think that's one of the things that I recognized when I first read your first biography, the first part of your series about Joseph Smith, is I recognized that inclination in me to, when I was a believer, especially on my mission, to want to do good for people, but that also recognized, like, this is largely how I see the contemporary leaders of the LDS Church, which was one of the questions that I had gotten before the episode, is if we think pious fraud, or if you, Dan, think that pious fraud is a useful model to understand the contemporary leaders of the church. Before I ask you that, I'll say I do, in the sense that I know, well, I feel certain that they know that the church isn't true in the way that most of the members believe that it's true. But they do believe that it's true and that it's good for people. And at least that's my view. And so I think that they, just like Joseph Smith, can engage in this justification of a level of deception. But I don't even think they necessarily see it as deception in the same way that Joseph did. It's more like just the complex nature of faith. And like you talked about, this symbiotic relationship that followers and a leader, a really charismatic leader, can have. I don't know if that gives you anything to break off, but I really like that point, because I think that's one of the reasons that I have landed on deciding that, whatever term we want to use, sincere charlatan, pious fraud, I can recognize value in that, because I can see the same inclinations in parts of me in my life when I was a believer, that I was making promises that maybe weren't going to work out for people, but I thought that they would. Weirdly, I don't know. Does that connect with either of you in a way? Anyway,
I'll just say, throughout this whole thing, I am the first to say that I've put myself a lot into this discussion and how I see. I mean, I know I shared on Discord and probably in the last one, but seeing the polygamy and specifically what he did to Emma, right? What Joseph did to Emma behind her back. I was cheated on by my ex, right? And so I see that. Mm-hmm. So it's hard for me to say. I always saw piety as something like, a strong religious belief, something commendable. Like that's how and so a pious fraud to me always was like, it's softening a little bit. And I don't see him, again, putting him as so for me, I fully admit, and I will say I've put myself into a lot of this because of what I've experienced. But I do completely see, like I said, the thing that I'm taking away from this, and maybe this is my last little bit, but what I take away from this is I can see the pious fraud from the pseudepigrapha and his starts, his first vision, his which again I don't think was necessarily a vision, but probably his born again experience that he had. I can see the piety, I can see the sincerity of that, but then I think it transitions into absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that's where I then see him like any other cult leader, and I don't see the need, because of what I experienced, I don't see the need to sugarcoat or see any way to make it good somehow of what he did, but just like any other cult leader, that somebody untrustworthy, somebody not to believe in, somebody unworthy of my my praise. No praise to the man from this side. So
sure, I wouldn't argue with that. About current leaders, though, I think they're creatures of the institution. They are locked into, they're institutional leaders, and they will do everything they can to preserve and promote the institution. That's all what church ends up being. I thought when I used to go to church, how to build the institution, make the institution better and bigger and more plentiful, and it was all institution building. It really got in the way of any spirituality there possibly could be. I believe humans have spiritual dimensions to them, but they're not otherworldly kind of things. They're just biological parts of our brain, and but we call it spiritual for want of a better word. That would be another word, like pious fraud, that is a term of art. so
Hitchens used the term to describe like kind of that different form of spirituality, in the sense that it's not supernatural. He used
more psychological.
Yeah, he used the word numinous, which I've really liked, for that same concept. Because, I have had those experiences. I wouldn't call them spiritual in the way the most religious believers would, but I've had them at live music concerts. I've had them in, all sorts of different scenarios. Having good conversations like this, I feel like, is one way I can experience that type of, I guess just this moment of, syzygy or synchronicity.
Synergy.
Synergy that lines up. The example I've used before is I hadn't read Orwell's 1984 for like a decade, and one day I just decided to randomly sit down and read it. You can read the entire thing in like an afternoon because it's not that long and it's a pretty easy read. I just so happened to sit down and read 1984 on the day that 1984 opens in 1984. I think it's April 8th, if I remember correctly. And it's like, if I was a religious believer, if this was a religious text and I was employing a test that most religious believers would, I would look at that complete coincidence and attribute some grand meaning to it. Instead, I just kind of chuckled and said like, oh, the odds of that aren't great, but kind of just a weird moment of where the universe kind of lines up.
Synchronicity.
Weirdly. Yeah, synchronicity.
As Jung would call it. Yeah. So, I'm not a Jungian, but anyway, so the spiritual dimension, we all know kind of what it is, but I believe religions, cultists or whatever, exploit it and try to manipulate people through it. That don't understand what it is, really.
Well, I think Dan actually pointed out just something for my mission when he's talking about the leaders now being pious frauds or whatever, that they're building the institution. Like that's their primary goal, and that's the ends that justify the means, which I think, at least for me, I saw in my mission. It was all about the sales. The whole like parable
numbers.
Of the black sheep or going after going after the one and leaving the 99, that went out the door, because no, you had the 99 numbers, that's what you had to get. And that whole sales aspect of the missionary experience, I hated it. But I see the leaders of the church now as following that. It's a business to them, and it's all the little lies they have to make about whether or not they've seen Jesus in the temple, or they allude to it without actually stating it. That justifies the means of growing the kingdom, right? So I would say, in that respect, I would call them pious frauds, but it's just an extension or an outgrowth of everything I think we've all experienced on our missions.
And I think the element that I see as very similar to Joseph Smith is that they think that deception, even though I don't think it's as outright as Joseph's,
Right.
I think they think that's ultimately justified because they probably do legitimately believe that the church is going to be good in people's lives. And I think they do largely believe the supernatural claims because, of course, those are completely unfalsifiable.
Right.
I just feel certain that they know it's not true in the way that most members believe that it's true, in the way that they repeatedly teach that it's true. And I think then it's just they justify it in their minds.
I don't think they're scholarly or historical minded at all.
Yeah, that's probably true. I've been surprised actually when I listen to General Conference how often they just run headlong into like these giant theological problems that have existed for like a millennia and seem completely unaware. So maybe you're right, Dan. Maybe I'm attributing to them.
They're just like anyone else, I think. Your average Mormon. They don't know any secrets. They don't become general authorities and they hand them this book that has all the truth in it or something. They don't know anything more than what your average member knows.
Yeah.
So they're not historians, and I'm not a religious leader, so I don't tell them what to do in that area. But
and to your point of the institution, the other reality is the institution, I think, especially after Arrington, right? Like the institution weeds out anybody who's going to ask tough questions. Like I know it's kind of a secret Exmo pipe dream that someone's going to get into the upper leadership, or sometimes people will point at someone like not Bednar, but Uchtdorf and think like maybe he'll come out and be more truthful. And it's like by the time you get to that point, you are so church broke that it's not even possible in my view. So here's a fun one. If the Smithsonian said they dug up swords at Moroni's last battle at Cumorah, would you go back to the church? I'd like to answer this one first, and then I'll go to Dan and then Sloan. I think this one's fun, even though we can talk about the archaeology of that particular site. I'm just going to treat this as a pure hypothetical. They find Zarahemla, they find whatever compelling archaeological evidence of actual Book of Mormon historical claims. Would I go back to church? My answer is no. I think you can make an entirely internal case for the failure of the institution of the LDS Church to live up to the Book of Mormon. So even if the Book of Mormon were proven to me tomorrow to be historical, I would not go back to the LDS Church. Dan, you want to take that one, and then I'll go to Sloan?
Well, I'm a complete failure as a Mormon anyway, so I like my life the way it is. But if they found the evidence that proved the Book of Mormon, which it's not going to happen, and it's a counterfactual question. So, but if it did, of course, I would believe. I wouldn't be. Why would I be stubborn and reject the Book of Mormon when I knew it was true? I mean, of course, the Mormons have this myth about sons of perdition. They know the truth, and they're fighting against the light and all that kind of stuff. But that's not real.
yeah, that's just made up. And I guess I'm saying actually that we were all taught on our missions a very clean line of reasoning. If the Book of Mormon is true, then the church is true. Or I'm sorry, if the Book of Mormon is true, then Joseph Smith is a true prophet. Then the church today is his correct institution. I think I'm saying I could grant Book of Mormon historicity if that evidence was produced. It's never going to be, but if it was. But I reject the idea that there's all these follow-on effects from that. I reject that line of reasoning.
Well, why wouldn't I go to the Community of Christ?
Yeah.
Why would I go to the Utah Church? What's the connection? I think there's a big assumption there about their authority because the numbers,
Right. Sloan, do you want to address this one?
Well, that's what I was actually going to say is I think, they say the Book of Mormon, you have to crawl over, I think is what Jeffrey R. Holland said, the Book of Mormon. If they prove that the Book of Mormon, without a doubt, shadow of a doubt, they find the evidence down in Amazon, where they're doing all the LiDAR, supposedly, that they're going to find all these cities that were in the Book of Mormon. Fine. Okay, the Book of Mormon happens to be true. I don't think that justifies Joseph Smith as later on. Maybe he started out. I can't see Joseph
maybe
Smith,
he was a fallen prophet.
And if that's the case, that doesn't mean the church is then true. And to Dan's point, I would probably go to the Community of Christ, because for me, they were the ones who saw the problems with polygamy earlier on. I would have been less ashamed of having been Mormon had I been a part of the Community of Christ. Because once I found out the gospel topics essays and found out, oh, actually Joseph Smith, all this stuff that I was taught were anti-Mormon lies, I was more ashamed to be part of the church that was pro-polygamy than the one that rejected it, with Emma and Joseph Smith III. So, yeah.
Right.
So I would be, okay, the Book of Mormon's true, but why did Joseph Smith lie about Peter, James, and John and John the Baptist?
Yeah.
So,
well, the other thing I would point to is that if we're to believe everything that comes out of Joseph Smith, meaning like revelations that come after the Book of Mormon, my bigger issue is actually that the cosmology, like Joseph Smith has completely contradictory cosmologies. The Book of Mormon posits a reality where God can cease to be God, which would mean that the moral laws or divine laws, whatever we want to call them, are supreme in that form of cosmology. That's also in Doctrine and Covenants 93. I wouldn't even know how to square that, really. There's so many issues we could get into that even if the Book of Mormon were proven to be historical, I just reject the logic that it's like, because the Book of Mormon's proven to be historical, therefore the church today is Christ's true church. I think you could grant a historical Book of Mormon. In fact, one of the things that Nemo the Mormon and I offered to do on this channel, which no one took me up on, unsurprisingly to me, is we offered to grant the entirety of the Book of Mormon, the entirety of the Restoration, and say that the SEC debacle in February of 2023 completely delegitimizes any of the contemporary leaders of the LDS Church, and no apologist wanted to talk to us about that issue, which kind of just goes to my point, is I reject the logic of saying because the Book of Mormon is historical, therefore all these follow-on claims that I don't think follow.
Well, that actually goes to, I think, speaks to the polygamy deniers, right? And specifically, they're saying Joseph didn't practice polygamy, but then the church fell into apostasy after they said God would never take the church again, the truth from the earth. And then we have all these prophets that were in apostasy, and the church is in apostasy, and that's now the church that they want to be a part of. So it seems like they lose either way, right? Whether it be, okay, Joseph didn't practice polygamy, but then all of these other prophets are in apostasy, and even the church now would be in apostasy, or Joseph did practice polygamy. So I don't get it.
Yeah. I've got one last question, Dan, that I want to ask you, and then we'll get some closing thoughts and wrap up. One that came in was, and you and I have had this conversation privately, but I don't know how much this individual has heard it. They said, how did Dan get started into his historical deep dives? What kind of shook that loose for you?
a historical point. Well, probably on my mission. I was more a scriptorian before that. In my teens, because I was debating Campus Crusade kids in high school about the Bible, and I was a Mormon, and I hadn't read a thing. I was in an inactive family, really, and I couldn't answer things, so I went to my grandma, who was the Mormon side of my dad's mother, and got missionary materials, and read them and used that proof texting kind of debate. But on my mission, I got exposed to the Tanner's material, Reverend of the Elam, what is it? Episcopal? No.
John Cuthbert.
Yeah,
Brent
John
Metcalf
Cuthbert
helped you out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so Pentecostal church. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for. he had materials and he showed them to me, and he would photocopy parts of their materials and present them in little pamphlet form kind of things. And he had tapes where he would have different voices, English men, reading Joseph Smith's Moon Men kind of stuff. And so I wanted to meet him in where when I went to his church, and his church had been struck by lightning, and we drove by it, and it had scaffolding around it and stuff. And so we knocked on his door, and so and being a smartass like I am, I come from a long line of smartasses, actually. So I come by it like honestly. So I said, "Did you declare that as an act of God in your insurance?" so he laughed, and we hit it off really good, and he took me into his office, me and my companion, and he was showing me the tenors. You don't know the tenors? And I go, no, I haven't ever heard of them. And he was showing me the changes in the revelations, and I'm like going, what? Changes in the revelations, So on my mission, I couldn't do anything about it. So, but I told myself that I would look this up the first opportunity. So when I got home, he had said that they lived near a baseball field, so near Temple Square, and I'm just driving around with my good friend, who just got home from his mission too. So we're driving around Salt Lake City, and we're looking for former companions, actually, just to say hi and stuff. And I drove around the baseball field until I ran into Modern Microfilm Company, above the door of their house.
Mm-hmm.
And I went in and I talked to Sandra Tanner and was looking at their books. I said, what's the best books you got? So she showed me, and I bought them, and I had my friend drive home while I was like reading them like crazy. And I just kept reading them. I go, there's got to be answers. And so I was being really trying to be a good Mormon apologist and trying to answer all this stuff. I go, well, they're using a lot of, let's say Wes Walder's stuff. So I got a hold of Wes Walder's, and I read his stuff, and Mike Marquardt for the Book of Abraham. And I was reading his stuff and talking to everybody on the phone. And we would write long letters. There was no email or anything. We would write long letters, 20-page letters, answering back and forth and about historical issues. The First Vision was one of the ones. And I remember doing research at BYU and sitting right near Milton Bachman in his book on the First Vision, and his answer to Wes Walder's, even though he never mentioned Wes Walder's name. They have a bad habit of responding to apologists, nameless apologists. Right. They do that all the time. They won't mention anybody's name. They even appropriate some of our ideas without giving us any credit.
Right.
And Bachman, we were arguing about the First Vision, and I was saying, well, Walter says this, what do you say? And we went back and forth, and he looked at me and goes, what's your name? Like, you sure know a lot, Yeah, I go, I've been like studying this stuff. I'm in BYU doing in the special collections, is doing stuff. This is like, I think early 80s, probably. So that's kind of my entry into that. And I remember one of the letters I wrote to Reverend Walters about the translation of the Book of Mormon. He published it in a thing called the Journal of Pastoral Practice. He goes, can I publish it? I go, sure, go ahead. So he did. It was a thing about whether the translation was, Joseph Smith at least claimed, it came from the stone. It was a direct translation or a more conceptual translation, as apologists like to say, which is nothing that Joseph Smith ever claimed, really. Well, they try to use the Oliver Cowdery passage. And
isn't that so interesting, though, that like if you actually stick to what Joseph Smith and anyone who is involved in the translation project said, it's there's no other model except for tight translation, like word for word dictation, even correcting spelling. It's so interesting that I bet if you were able to poll most believing members, they actually would go more along the lines of that expansion theory, more conceptual translation, because you need to basically to solve so
what do you
many.
think the glasses were for?
Right.
I
Right.
mean,
Exactly.
he was called a reader. He read the translation, and that was to increase faith. So David Whitmer said he got his description from Joseph Smith.
Right.
He didn't make it up. A lot of people say he couldn't see what was in the stone. Well, no, but Joseph Smith told him what he saw in the stone, that it was like an interlinear Bible translation, right? He had the characters and the English underneath, and he read the English word for word, because that would increase people's faith. That's why he told them that. Now, I don't know how much time you have, but Richard Bushman brought up, hey, what other seer, stone gazer ever translated with the stone? Meaning, he's implying Joseph Smith is unique, therefore it must be true. Well, that's a non sequitur, of course, but
no.
But I think we don't know much about how he was doing his money digging, but he likely thought he saw people burying treasures. He saw a fight between an Indian, two Indians when they buried a trunk. He seen pirates, bleeding ghosts. And he saw all sorts of things. I imagine at some point he saw a Spanish treasure map and was able to read it using his phone.
Do you think, Dan, that line from Lucy Mack's biography of Joseph Smith, that he would rehearse? I mean, I view it as he was rehearsing kind of these stories when it talks about him, enthralling the whole family with these stories of the people who lived here, as if he'd lived his whole life among them. Do you see that as, I guess I'm kind of expanding from Pious Fraud just to questions I'd like to ask you, but do you see that as part of the production of the Book of Mormon? And I guess the reason I ask that is because one of my frustration points with apologists is they're often hyper fixated on that time window. Like, how could he dictate the Book of Mormon in 60 days? And one of the things I told Murph in the episode that we did together is, well, that's the dictation timeline. Dictation timeline is completely different from how long he had to, even if he's unaware. Like, I don't know how aware he is of legitimately believing delusionally in whatever, some relationship with some type of angelic visitor that's telling him these stories. I guess I'm saying, do you see that as a significant piece of evidence for how Joseph Smith created the Book of Mormon, that quote from Lucy Mack? Because I do, and I'm wondering if you do.
Well, he's telling stories. Who knows if it later showed up in the Book of Mormon or not? But
right.
I think Lucy's sanitized it a little bit, that it was still in a money digging kind of context, and I think he's reading the book that's still in the hill. He put the stone in his hat, and he read he dictated the Book of Mormon while it was in the woods, right? So I believe he's reading the book in the hill and answering these kind of religious questions and telling these stories that Lucy mentions, all sorts of things, as if he lived among them. I think he's like reading the book already, right away, but it's in the hill. But at some point, there was pressure on him to actually get the plates,
right,
as evidence, but he never uses them because he never intended in his story to use the plates. He was just going to read the plates, and he didn't need them, but he got them in order to increase faith. He created them himself, I have argued, out of tin. So,
right.
So I think, he's stories. He's been practicing. He's been telling stories about Indians burying treasure. Which ends up in the Book of Mormon, of course, of the slippery treasures in the Book of Mormon. I mean, that's a dead giveaway. So he's telling stories about pirates. He's a storyteller. He's practicing these stories. He makes them up, more or less. Well, I don't think he's making them up necessarily as he's going. Some of it is. I mean, he is dictating, but I think the average dictation lasted a couple of hours per day. 8 pages a day. Takes only a couple of hours to dictate. So, what was he doing the rest of the time? He was thinking about it, working it out in your mind, asking God if it's right. If it's right, you have a burning in your bosom. If it's wrong, you'll have a stupor thought. So that's what he was doing. He was working it out in his mind over and over and over. He was totally 100% into it, obsessed by it.
Sloan, you've got something?
Yeah, so in my mind, and this is just, correct me if I'm wrong, but, I think I see young Joseph as, we've all had those nerdy kids in high school who knew the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit inside and out. They learned how to speak Elvish or Elven or whatever. They knew
some of us were
all
those
the backstories. Touche. But that was Joseph with the Bible, right? And I think that him being so engrossed in that, as I think Colby, I assume with your Sunstone presentation, he could just pull stuff from because what do you call it? Like engulfed his life so much, and it was
inhabited.
He was reading, and it inhabited his mind. The words became his because he had read them so much and was so just engrossed by all of it that then he became. It would be like him trying to dictate a Lord of the Rings fan fiction for somebody who had spent 20 years of his life being that just surrounded and every day reading and being immersed in Lord of the Rings, right? I think that's how I see young Joseph, but my 2 cents. So
no, I completely agree with that. I mean, I've been doing a lot of thought about the creation of the Book of Mormon. I've been having conversations with Ganesh about that, and I think one of the characters that is actually more of a setting, but that is often left on the table, is what you just talked about, Sloan, is this world of the Second Great Awakening that Joseph Smith is experiencing. Apologists always cry presentism anytime we judge Joseph Smith with contemporary moral standards, but that stick should be picked up on both ends if we're going to pick it up. And one way that we don't understand Joseph Smith's world, based on our experience, where we have a more strict separation of church and state, provided that holds, hopefully, is kids were taught to read using the Bible in Joseph Smith's day and age. Like, this would have been the book that he had more experience with than any other book. And that Sunstone presentation looks at that, basically looks at how he was able to take, and these are letters dictated within months of the Book of Mormon's publication to the Colesville Saints. Joseph Smith is able to take, in one sentence in that analysis that I ran, Joseph Smith is able to take like double-digit levels of scriptural phrases, allusions, or references and work them into a new cohesive message in one single sentence. So I think that is super, super accurate, Sloan.
Yeah. Well, I've always said he spoke fluent Bible.
Right.
Yeah, King James Bible. Exactly.
It was in. Well, the Quakers, that's how they spoke. Yeah. And Martin Harris was a Quaker, and there was Quakers around, and Quakers spoke King James style English.
Well, this has been a lot of fun, you two. Thank you so much, Dan, for being willing to sit for some questions and help us model respectful disagreement here on Let's Disagree. I really just want to, I know that you often don't like compliments because you were raised Mormon, and all people who are raised Mormon tend to be uncomfortable with them. But I truly just want to tell you, since I have the chance to interview you for the first time, how much I have appreciated your contribution to Mormon studies and all of the work you've done. I really feel like your book on Book of Abraham apologetics is one of the, like, I recommend it all the time to people when they want to understand why apologists are making the arguments they are about these documents and understand the documents for themselves, because I think your work on that is just unparalleled. And I really appreciate you taking the time to address some of these questions and help people better understand this pious fraud theory. Even if they don't ultimately accept it, I completely understand why people look at the entirety of Joseph Smith's life and go, fraud, charlatan is just a fine descriptor to me. I have been convinced as I've engaged with your theory that I think it is kind of a better model to understanding Joseph Smith through the lens of Joseph Smith. And I think my defense of why I think it's important, and then I'll get some closing thoughts from Sloan and then to you, Dan. My closing thought on why I think that term is important, as imperfect as it may be, is because it signals us to an important category of danger that we otherwise don't understand. That someone who, like Joseph Smith, is sincerely convinced that what they're doing is for other people's good, even though they're doing bad things. I think understanding the psychology behind that cues us into a very important danger that does exist still today. I would look at like Tim Ballard. Like, can Tim Ballard really separate out like his bad action from like him feeling like he's called of God to do certain things? I don't know. I think he's another contemporary analog, I guess I would point to. Sloan, let me get your closing thoughts, and then we'll go to Dan.
Yeah, my closing thoughts. I will just say, Dan, I bow to your awesomeness. So thank you for all that you do. And I would just say, you know, I didn't mean to start this firestorm, but I will say, talking with you, listening to you, also I would say some of your comments, the previous video, it actually helped me better understand the pious fraud theory, right? And better understand, yes, I can get behind it, at least for the Book of Mormon. I 100% think that was pious fraud, right? I may not say that for other aspects of his life, but 100% that was pious fraud. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us and give some more clarity.
Yeah.
And like I said, we can just learn so much from you've probably forgotten more than I've ever learned about Joseph Smith and Mormon history. So thank you so much for taking the time, and I really appreciate it.
Well, Sloan, thanks for being a good sport and showing up. And I hope I've helped you. That's all I want to do is I can't ask any more than you at least understand the theory, okay, and maybe more accurately than you did before our discussion. I mean, I'm not out to force or try to be overly forceful with people to accept this or that. It's just a theory, okay? It's one way to look at Joseph Smith. There are other ways. All those labels that Kendall was throwing out, I mean, they all apply. They all apply to Joseph Smith. Okay, so this is just a nuanced way of looking at Joseph Smith that I think has some advantages that other interpretations don't. The extreme villain or hero, and it helped me come to terms with Joseph Smith in my own way, that he was more complex, more living and interesting to me. He's more interesting than your villain, you know. So thanks for considering it. That's all I can say. And Colby, I'm a big fan of yours because I think you are very articulate and can explain things really well. And we have kind of a similar, fallacy logic kind of
detector.
Yeah,
Similar.
The baloney
similar,
detecting machine.
That's right. I was going to say bullshit detector because it's my
Yeah.
channel and I can say what I want.
And
To the advantages of independence, like we said.
we're kind of both fans of Hitchinson, you know.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, thanks for considering me and for interviewee, you know. And I was very, you know, had a lot of fun.
Oh, thanks so much, Dan. I really appreciate that. And hearing that you're a fan of me, you already made my month earlier when you commented positively. So, folks, thanks for joining us for tonight's live stream. I hope that you found this conversation both interesting and that we've modeled kind of respectful disagreement and how we can understand each other's perspectives. Even if we don't ultimately change our minds, understanding each other is just so much better. Like understanding the view that we don't espouse and being able to steelman each other's perspectives, I think is just such a valuable tool. So I thank you both again for helping model that tonight on Let's episode of Let's Disagree live, our live episode tonight. Folks, please like, subscribe, and stay tuned here for more interesting conversations like this in the future.